Hi, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Garrett Nelson. I'm the president and head curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And you are tuned in to a live talk with Professor Michele Navakas on liquid landscapes and the edges of America, from the Revolutionary era to today. Tonight's talk is the first in a new series at the Leventhal Center, the Richard H. Brown Seminar on the Historical Geography of the American Revolutionary Era. In this series, we'll be exploring how maps and geography can open up new ways of understanding one of the most important periods in American history, the second half of the 18th century, when nations, borders, people, and the natural environment were in a state of dramatic flux throughout North America and across the Atlantic world. To learn more about upcoming events in this series, as well as other free programs and activities at the Leventhal Center, visit our website at leventhalmap.org. Before we begin our program, I want to take note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston is the ancestral home and current home to Indigenous peoples, including the Mashpee and Aquinnah Wampanoag tribes, the Nipmuc nations, and descendants of the Massachusetts people. Copley Square, where I am right now, sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. The maps that are in our collections here bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts ranging from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, the maps don't simply document these stories, but actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Throughout all of our programs and interpretation, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. The Leventhal Center is an independent nonprofit, and we rely on contributions from viewers like you to support our free programs in areas ranging from geographic research and public talks to K-12 education and the preservation of our collections. If you enjoyed today's event, consider visiting leventhalmap.org/donate afterwards. Even a donation of just a few dollars helps support our mission of making programs that everyone can access, and you can contribute with just a few clicks. Tonight, I'm also joined by a co-host, Dr. Alexandra Montgomery. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Garrett. Hi, everybody.
Dr. Montgomery is a historian who's serving as the inaugural postdoctoral fellow for a project that we're working on together with the Washington Library at Mount Vernon called American Revolutionary Geographies Online, or ARGO. In the ARGO project, we'll be expanding the Leventhal Center's existing digital collections on the Revolutionary period and supporting research and education programs that connect maps and geography to the history of early America. Keep an eye out on our social media at BPL Maps for more news about this exciting new initiative. Finally, I want to welcome tonight's guest, Dr. Michele Navakas. She's an associate professor of English at Miami University, Ohio, where she teaches early American literature and environmental humanities. She's the author of Liquid Landscape, Geography and Settlement at the Edge of Early America, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018, which won the Florida Historical Society's Rembert Patrick Award and Stetson Kennedy Award. Now, I am thrilled that Professor Navakas could join us as the first speaker in this series because her work shows just how provocatively maps, territory, and landscape can weave into broader narratives of American history and culture. As she puts it, her work, quote, unsettles an overly solid historical, geographical, rhetorical, and theoretical conception of the United States that was not shared by everyone calling it home, end quote. And she does so by paying close attention to exactly how both material and imagined senses of place affected American history. Now, if you're interested in the arguments that you hear tonight, you can purchase Liquid Landscape for 30% off from the University of Pennsylvania Press by following the link below. It's on sale for participants in this event through August 16th. I should also note that Professor Navakas is currently at work on what sounds like an equally fascinating new book called An Early American Coral, A Literary and Cultural History. It's a study of the literary and cultural significance of coral from early America to the present day. This new book will tell the story of coral as at once a global commodity, a personal ornament, an essential element of the marine ecosystem, and a powerful political metaphor. Now, in tonight's talk, Professor Navakas will start us off with an introduction to her work and her argument. After that, Alexandra and I will lead a short discussion, but most importantly, we want to hear from all of you. At any time, you can write a comment or a question into the section of YouTube or Facebook below, depending on what channel you're watching on tonight, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. We're hoping to make it feel as though we're all in a group together with those of you who are tuning in from all corners of the world. So I won't spend any more time stealing from tonight's really exciting talk. Thanks to Professor Navakas for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. You can hear me all right?
Sounds great.
Okay. So thank you so much for that introduction, and also for inviting me to give this talk, and also thanks to the Leventhal Center for hosting this new series on the historical geography of the Revolutionary period. So this talk comes from my 2018 book, Liquid Landscape, and it's a study of writing about early Florida. But the book also comes from my experience growing up in Florida and then going to grad school and studying early America, only to find that Florida was largely left out of that history. The book is my way of asking what might happen to our understanding of America, past and present, when we realize how formative Florida and its various populations have always been, culturally and politically, to the development of U.S. identity. So today's talk will be about 20 minutes. I'll link together my research on historical maps of South Florida as a porous, watery landscape, my studies of how different groups of people inhabited that landscape, and my thinking about what environmental lessons we might learn from these maps and histories now. I want to begin with the words of Elizabeth Rush, whose 2018 book, titled Rising, explores how coastal communities across the U.S. are confronting the reality of sea level rise. Real resiliency might mean letting go of our static image of the coastline. Rush observes that a major barrier to human survival in the U.S. in an age of rising seas is a particular conception of all land as solid, stable, and unchanging, or at least capable of becoming so with enough draining, filling, and building of seawalls. That conception of land has, Rush demonstrates, misled us into a number of perilous decisions for which many are now paying the price. These decisions include building high-rises along fragile shorelines, creating whole neighborhoods on coastal marshes and estuaries so that they can no longer absorb deadly storm surges, and constructing entire communities atop wetlands, leaving nowhere for water to drain. Considering how powerfully this mistaken understanding of land has shaped U.S. decision-making and experience, it seems important to ask where we got this perilous idea and how it acquired such influence. That's a question once asked by literary scholar, feminist, and environmental historian Annette Kolodny during the 1970s and 80s in her brilliant studies of the metaphors that early Americans used when describing American land. In early literature, maps, and other documents, Kolodny identifies a persistent interest in mastering and transforming the landscape, an interest that depends on the assumption that nearly all land can be cultivated, divided into private property, fenced and bounded, and settled upon permanently. Of special importance in fueling this idea around the Revolutionary period was an emergent, rather nationalistic understanding of the U.S. as a single, solid, neatly bounded landmass, the continent. This understanding took form through continental maps of North America. An idealized geographic form, the continent helped a new nation imagine itself as both independent and culturally unified, destined to overspread a mainland there for the taking. Here, for example, is geographer Amos Doolittle's 1784 map, which proclaims the new nation's continental status in the words of one recent scholar. Doolittle illustrates the emerging U.S. as a contiguous territory stretching from British Canada to Spanish Florida, and bordered sharply on the west and east by the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean, respectively. This aspirational figure of the continent declared the new nation's independence, sovereignty, and destiny to become one nation united under one government. It also, I would add, invigorated that enduring and dangerous sense of American land as solid and durable. As Kolodny concludes rather presciently for 1975, let me show you her words, "Our survival may depend on understanding and altering the disastrous attitudes toward the physical setting that we have inherited from our national past. But what if there are alternative attitudes toward the physical setting that are just as much a part of our national past as the iconic, sharply bounded, abstract figure of the continent? And if our national past does contain such alternatives, where might we find them, and what might we learn from them now? To begin to answer these questions, I draw your attention to a particular portion of Doolittle's iconic map, the part describing Florida. By sharp contrast with the solid reality, the terra firma of the rest of the map, the Florida portion is ragged and fractured. It's broken into multiple islands, scattering into the Gulf of Mexico, almost like waves had swept the land, leaving it in shards. It might be surprising to learn that Doolittle's depiction of Florida as islands was by no means unusual during the 18th century. We can see that by looking at a sampling of widely circulating maps produced by cartographers of different nationalities. This map is the first known map of Florida as islands. Printed in 1708, it was created by Thomas Nairn, British South Carolina's first agent to the American Indians. Nairn's map displays Florida in fragments so dramatically dispersed that they overlap the lower frame as though Florida could not be contained. And here is Paris-based cartographer Guillaume de Lille's interpretation of Florida on a 1718 map that is one of the most highly influential maps of North America created during the 18th century. Another version of Florida as islands appears on a 1717 map by a German cartographer. And we find this very different Florida as islands on a map published in a Dutch atlas in 1769. Now, in order to see all of these island Floridas together, as an 18th century person might have been able to do, I've gathered them all on this next slide. The sampling here suggests that during the 18th century, Florida was imagined in a multiplicity of island arrangements, varying in number, shape, and size. The maps thus speak to a sense of wild uncertainty about what constitutes the ground and bounds of Florida, and thereby of the southeastern edge of North America. For when we look at these maps together, we have to ask, where exactly does the continent end? Now, in my book, I investigate the origins of this image of Florida as islands. It turns out to have a really fascinating origin story and indigenous descriptions of the land that Thomas Nairn, that British agent, heard from local populations when he was raiding Florida for American Indian captives. And I can discuss that more in the Q&A. I also, in the book, proceed to explore the implications of this image of Florida for how Americans imagined their emerging national identity during a time when that identity was, as we have seen, so often bolstered by images of solid and sharply bordered ground. But here, what I want to do is zero in on what this fractured, uncertain, fragmented Florida meant for settlers and prospective settlers. How did they live or imagine living on this kind of land that was nothing like the solid abstraction of the continent? And what models did they have for doing so? Now, during the 18th century, Florida passed back and forth among Spain and Great Britain. It was Spain's until 1763, then a British possession from 1763 to 1783, at which point it became Spanish again until the U.S. acquired it from Spain in 1821. But there's reason to believe that as early as the American Revolution, American political leaders were forecasting that Florida, then a British possession, would become part of the new nation. And there were good reasons for this, such as border security and stopping enslaved people from escaping south to seek freedom among the Seminole. But that's another story. The story I want to talk about now is how Anglo-Americans on the cusp of the nation's emergence would have thought about actually living in Florida. In 1764, during the year following Great Britain's acquisition of Florida from Spain, British officials appointed a rather unusual person, a German called Gerard de Brum, to survey what was then known as the Southern District of North America, an area that included all of Florida. As Surveyor General of that district, de Brum would live in St. Augustine and focus particularly on surveying the little-known coastline that stretched from that city on the northeastern coast of Florida all the way south to the Florida Keys. This coast, the British believed, had the most potential for settlement, and de Brum's goal was to produce maps that identify the most valuable sites. At the same time, He was working not only for the British government, but also for potential private landholders, so particular British men who commissioned him to create small-scale surveys of specific tracts of land that interested them. And I mention both jobs because they affirm the incredible wealth of local, first-hand knowledge on the micro level that DeBrums would have gained of Florida. Whereas some of the maps I've shown, some of those were made by people who never visited Florida at all and were sometimes based on written or oral accounts or even on other maps. DeBrums was close up, in person, and invested in getting it right. Now, what were those who employed DeBrums, both government officials and private landholders, what were they expecting of him? By and large, the goal of 18th century land surveys was to stabilize the land record, not only to give people accurate information, but also to allow them to imagine themselves and their communities as firmly emplaced within national or imperial territory. These surveys typically achieve that goal by representing land as immovable, and sometimes by inscribing parts of it with a proprietor's family name. As an experienced surveyor, DeBrums knew the conventions, and he had good reason for wanting to attract people to settle in Florida. More settlers meant more surveys, and so more money in his pocket. But DeBrums was more than a land surveyor, something of a polymath. He was also a mathematician, an engineer, a religious mystic of sorts, a botanist, a hydrographer, and most importantly, for our purposes, a geographer. So it was through these many disciplinary lenses that DeBrums looked at land. And perhaps that's why he ended up abandoning the traditional conventions of a survey when representing Florida. On two large fold-out maps that DeBrums made in 1772 of the same area as South Florida and the Florida Keys, he presents ground that is always in flux. Here is the first map. It's titled Chart of the South End of East Florida, and it represents the tip of Florida from the area around Miami south to Key West. And here is the second. This one shows the same region, but the map has a different title, pretty long title. It's called The Ancient Tegesta, now Promontory of East Florida, as it appears from its present condition, many marks and traces with what it with great probability can be ascertained to have been in former ages. What this second map basically shows, in other words, is not a real-time, present-day representation of the shape of Florida, as DeBrums saw the solid part of it in 1772. Instead, it presents the probable former outline of the solid land, based on the marks and traces, as he calls it, that DeBrums did see. Likely those were various submerged shoals and sandbanks. And Tegesta, by the way, is a name that derives from Tequesta, one of Florida's many indigenous societies that the Spanish had decimated. At any rate, when we view the two maps together, Florida appears to dissolve before our eyes. In the map at left, the shaded areas are presently submerged lands that were, at some point in the past, dry ground, which DeBrums fills in on the map at right. So together, the maps thus provide a sort of geohistory of the land, a view of its changes over time. And the accompanying narrative affirms that those changes are ongoing and unpredictable. As DeBrums writes, coastal Florida provides clear evidence that the continent has been and is to this day subject to yield its limits foot by foot to the Gulf Stream. He goes on to say that during his 3 years in Florida, he personally observed many places where the water swallowed the land or broke it into islands where once there was solid ground. The maps could not have exactly inspired confidence in prospective landholders. In fact, DeBrums was mocked for some of these representations, even called insane, in the words of one contemporary. But his maps capture a crucial reality and truth about the land. The same reality that the maps of Florida as islands also convey. Florida ground requires other modes of settlement. This is not the place for sturdy fences, vast cultivated fields, and traditional homes of the kind that one might build in New England. And that reality is one that settlers other than DeBrums, Anglo and Anglo-American contemporaries had in fact known for centuries. One of the most interesting parts of my research, to me anyway, has been the chance to examine the architecture of Florida's indigenous and non-native American Indians as they adapted to life on watery ground both before and after the arrival of white settlers. Of particular fascination to me are the Seminole. who arrived in Florida during the early 19th century and began living in the Everglades, and of course, many still do. And the Calusa, who controlled Florida's southern peninsula at the time of European arrival and were decimated by the mid-18th century through disease, warfare, slavery, and displacement. Both the Seminole and the Calusa practiced highly successful and enduring forms of landed possession on profoundly impermanent and changeable ground for at least 1,000 years in the case of the Calusa. How did they do it? Well, one way is that they learned the local complexities and realities of the land in question and then designed and built accordingly. So probably some of my listeners are familiar with the Seminole Chickee, a stilted home of sorts that's built upon very carefully selected sites in the Everglades. Some of these sites are known as hammocks or tree islands, and they prove more stable and dry as the water table changes. By building raised homes on strategically chosen rises of high ground, the Seminole lived quite well in a region that most Anglo-Americans of the period declared entirely unlivable. Likely of less familiarity, however, are the dwellings of the Calusa, who were arguably even more radical in their architectural design because their territory extended offshore into estuaries along the Gulf of Mexico. Estuaries, those places where fresh water flowing from the land meets the sea, are constantly changing as the levels of fresh and salt water change. And so for that reason, they're highly productive ecosystems and excellent food sources, but they are also really treacherous to live on. There are no surviving Calusa dwellings, but early European and American sources do document that the Calusa survived by living in structures on stilts. But unlike more traditional stilted homes, these structures would float, and I'm about to show you pictures of those. Pile dwellings is the name given to Calusa homes in an 1896 report by Frank Hamilton Cushing, the first ethnographer and archaeologist to study the Calusa. So Cushing describes the dwellings as follows. It's useful to hear the description, I think, before I show you an image. Each consisted of a horizontal platform of timber affixed to vertical piles that extended into the waters below. But these stilts were not anchored into the ground. Rather, they rested atop special mounds and ridges that the Calusa built from shells and sand in very carefully selected spots, so that, as Cushing writes, when the waters rose, the entire structures would also slightly rise, or at any rate not be violently wrenched from their supports, as would inevitably have been the case had these piles been firmly fixed below. So here is a contemporary artist's rendition. I've put this arrow here to signal the stilts you can see, hopefully. It's a contemporary artist's rendition of Calusa pile dwellings. And then below that is a drawing of a Calusa village of mounds, ridges, and canals, as those were imagined by an artist working in 1896. These images speak to how the piles and the mounds worked together to ensure Calusa durability and longevity. The mounds were immense construction projects requiring the careful management of scores of people working together to shape the land, guided by complex engineering skills and deep knowledge of ocean currents and topography at very carefully chosen sites. Only there could the storm surge be mitigated enough to allow the unanchored pile dwellings to support human life over the long term. Calusa control of South Florida for over 1,000 years is a strong testament to the power of knowing the ground, tracking how it changes over time, and then engineering solutions that sustain communities. What can the example of Calusa estuary settlement tell us about our own present-day modes of living on watery ground, particularly in an age of rising seas when it's no longer a question of if more U.S. coasts will become unlivable, but when? In 2019, and supposedly in response to the realities of sea level rise, one architectural firm created what it calls a floating home, which at first glance appears remarkably similar to a Calusa pile dwelling. According to the firm's website, quote, when elevated on its hydraulic pilings, the vessel is as stable as a house and protected from the action of the waves. The idea is that when the water rises, you simply rise above it by extending the pilings down to seafloor to suspend your home above the waves until things settle down. Or, as a newspaper article about the home puts it, quote, when you're kicking back in your new $5.9 million solar-powered floating home, you won't mind how high the sea level rises, because you'll rise right with it. Now, at first, this floating home seems like straight-up Calusa design, a pile dwelling for the 21st century. Just like the Calusa, the home's creators are under no illusion that all land is solid, stable, and predictable. They get that some land moves, and the best way for us to survive is to move with it. But the fatal flaw in this contemporary design is that there is no us. Aside from the important and obvious fact that very few people could afford to own such a home, the home is built with the assumption that anyone who buys it can survive on their own anywhere in the world, as the website says. For, quote, its self-contained systems allow fully off-the-grid living and total autonomy. But if there's one thing that Calusa history tells us, it's that it's not enough to just add stilts. You have to work with the land. The Calusa only built in select places and with deep local knowledge of the site, of its tides and variations, its topography, its diurnal and yearly rhythms. They then engineered the land itself, collaborating to build earthworks and dig wide canals that had to be monitored and maintained over time so that their communities could remain stable. In the end, then, nothing about the modern floating home is really sustainable or future-proof, as the promotional ad copy claims. Perhaps that's because the Calusa knew something else that the homes designers don't. You can't really hole up and ride out rising seas with the expectation that soon everything will go back to normal. Today, after every major hurricane, the national news runs stories about how people should not live in Florida anyway. It was never meant for human habitation. Here are some headlines that appeared in the wake of Hurricane Irma, for example, in September 2017. So, should we really be living in Florida? And a requiem for Florida, a paradise that never should have been. But maybe the real problem is that we've forgotten that our cultural past already includes models of quite successful ways to live enduringly on shifting, porous, unstable, fractured ground, if only we know where to look in the historical record. Instead of either declaring Florida wholly unlivable or buying a $6 million floating house, we should be asking how people once managed to live there for so long. History tells us that this land was never meant to be lived on in the ways that we have come to inhabit it, but it also tells us how to live there better. If, to quote Elizabeth Rush in Rising, real resiliency might mean letting go of our static image of the coastline, then there are few better ways to practice that necessary abandonment than looking to the historical landscapes of Florida and the histories of the people who lived there. And anyway, that history is one of the few places left where we can see the land not as we have tried to solidify and remake it, but rather as it actually is, erosive, fragile, and always in passage. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. This was really fantastic. It's a good thing that I was off the screen because I've been kind of furiously nodding along with every slide that goes by.
Thank you.
So Alexandra and I are going to have a short discussion with you, but a reminder to our viewers, you can drop a question in the comment section of YouTube or Facebook at any time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible before the end of the evening. Michelle, I'm going to hide your slides just for now, but if you want to bring them back up in order to refer to something that you showed, just let me know.
Sure.
Alexandra, I'll let you kick us off.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for that. It was a really, really wonderful talk. And I just want to emphasize how great and wonderful your book is. And I want to strongly recommend to all of our listeners that if you like this, you'll love the book. So I know that somewhere there is that coupon floating around to, there it is. So you can get it for a little bit of a discount, and I strongly encourage you to do so.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I really appreciated and enjoyed in the book that was also reflected in the talk that you gave today is this tension between these fluid spaces, Florida specifically, being kind of sites of resistance to or alternatives to kind of a dominant mode of living. In the book, it's more talking about sort of this expansion of kind of a settler colonial model of living where land wants to be divided off, or land doesn't want anything. People want to divide land off into little neat parcels and claim it in that way, and Florida resists that. And this idea that the lessons that you can take from these fluid spaces can kind of paradoxically make an imperial narrative stronger. which kind of reminded me of kind of like, the true steel that bends is the strongest steel kind of a metaphor. And I felt that today in the talk as well, where there was this kind of interesting tension with that very like strange $5 million house that you showed, between lessons of the past and fluid spaces giving us ways to live more sustainably today, and then also maybe those same lessons perhaps leading us towards a like Jetsonian future where the rich live on stilts and continue to mass produce sprockets at an alarming rate. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, on where you see that tension and how we might kind of sort through some of the questions that raises.
Yeah, that is an awesome question, and it's the question and the kind of tension that is, as you say, absolutely at the heart of the book. I think that was one of the things that made the book so challenging to write, is continually finding that tension, no matter where I looked in the archive, because in the book I look at all sorts of materials, from maps and surveys to novels and letters and narratives of Indian captivity set in Florida, and that was sort of what I was taking away the entire time, is that on the one hand, as you say, these are sites of resistance, and there's something really promising in that resistance. And what I was trying to do in the book too is kind of capture how some of these writers saw that promise. And even if that promise wasn't fulfilled on the ground in reality, they could at least imagine something better. And so, you have writers who recognize that resistance and recognize those local populations and are trying to kind of promote that. And they don't ever become mainstream writers. So like one of the books that I look at is James Fenimore Cooper. Most people associate him with the Western frontier, but he has a novel set on the Florida Reef. And that tension you're describing is right at the center of that book, because on the one hand, people who, well, let me just back up and say that the Florida Reef was this major point of entry into the Gulf of Mexico, still is, and people were trying to master that space for the sake of U.S. commerce. And so Cooper's novel is all about like trying to think about how to master this space for the sake of empire. But then there's these little moments where he's sort of like, but actually, it's pretty fascinating that there are these whole populations of wreckers who are living there, and they're kind of doing their own thing, and they're not linked to broader networks of U.S. commerce. And let's think about that for a minute. And what are they doing right? And so it's just this back and forth between those two. I don't know if I can't answer the question in terms of what to do about that, but I think that's what's so fascinating about these materials on Florida.
Michele, I have a question about time. As I was reading the book, as I heard you talking today, I kept thinking about how this idea of fixity versus fluidity is kind of a trick of time, right? Even the most fixed lands are crumbling, right? The Appalachians are slowly crumbling into the sea over the course of hundreds of millions of years. And it made me think about the way that history and literature both have a kind of time element to them that cartography seemingly doesn't, right? We seem to treat the map as a fixed frame instant in time, except when it doesn't, right? So you have these really interesting DeBrums depictions of a kind of geologic theory of South Florida over time. But can you point to any other cases where the cartographers or people who were producing visual representations of Floridian land and water were wrestling with this kind of time element? How do you portray something through a fixed or static medium that preserves its volubility in that sense? And do you see cases where that kind of time appears in the imagery?
That's such a wonderful question. I think honestly the case DeBrums maps make the strongest and most obvious case of it, because it was almost like he couldn't really decide. It's just so interesting to see him wrestling with his role to try to say, okay, here's land I'd like to sell you, but also it's probably shifting and going to fall into the sea anyway. It's just like, I like to imagine what the prospective landholders, they're like, okay, what? I can't even imagine what it was like when he presented these things. So that's my most, I think, more obvious case. But I love what you're saying, because I do think one of the things that is sort of maybe just a human problem is that we do tend to mistake what we're seeing today on the land as what has always been, and how it just sort of would remain that way. Like, oh, of course it's going to be this way. I don't know. I think that in terms of like the struggle to actually represent fluid land, I guess I'd say that's kind of everywhere in the archive to different, but it manifests in different ways. So I think even just in the struggle to map the Everglades would be a really good case of that. So the Everglades were so wildly unknown until well into the 19th century because they were just the point at which land did something that very obviously that maybe all land is doing, but like shifting, but that you couldn't really tell until you start looking at the Everglades. And then it's like, what is this? Is this land? Is this water? Do we need a canoe? How do we get over this land? How do we map and chart it? And so I think that especially on maps of the Everglades, I do think you see a little bit of that struggle of like, how do we manage this and how do we manage to present it? And one of the really interesting things to me, that first map I showed of the Florida as islands, the first known map of Florida as islands, there's strong suspicion in that entire image like came out of indigenous populations describing what they thought of as the Everglades to Europeans, and then Europeans trying to document what that description was. And so I think that's why you get all these wildly various pictures and images. And in so many narratives, it's the northern border of the Everglades that is like the test limit or the case where like the maps stop, where the narrative sort of gets sketchy about what happens next. And I don't know, I mean, the way you phrase that question is really interesting because is it a conceptual dilemma of literally like, wow, the land, we can see the land moving in a way that we can't otherwise, and so it kind of messes with your notions of what land should do over time.
Mm-hmm. To build on that, this is coming in part from a question in the chat from Tim Weisgold. I'm sorry, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, but he has sort of quite rightly pointed out that there are lots of other spaces in North America, estuary spaces that have been exploited in interesting and different and analogous ways by indigenous people. And of course, the idea of like a fen or a marsh is not new to Europeans. I'm thinking especially of like the massive fens of England before they were drained. So how do you see Florida existing in conversation with those other spaces? And are people bringing to bear their knowledge of other shifting spaces to try to understand the unique space of Florida? How do you see that, those things in conversation?
Yeah, I absolutely see that. And so what I would say about the another sort of central challenge of this book is trying to, on the one hand, I want to say, wow, Florida's so unique, but there are other spaces that do this. I guess what I would say is, on the one hand, I would still defend the claim that there is something unique about a space that is like made of porous limestone, continually assailed by hurricanes seasonally, is like filled with sinkholes, right? That is, the land is, that's partially made of a reef, right? I mean, these are just like some of the things that I do think make Florida somewhat unique, and then filled with swamps also. So I do think there's that. But I also would say that one of the things that I ended up kind of realizing through the course of my research is that Florida makes some of these problems more dramatically visible and more obvious on a larger scale than some of these other places. During the 17th and 18th century was like most of the eastern coast. I mean, there's a huge amount of swampland that is now no longer there. And most of the ways that at least Anglo-Americans responded to it was to try to ditch and drain. And I think that what was happening in Florida that's interesting to me is it's like people like would try and then just kind of give up and be like, this is impossible. You can't, we're basically trying to ditch and drain the ocean when we're doing this in Florida. So I think that's how I would frame it, is that there's something just on a scale, on a level that I think forces people to kind of come to grips with liquid land in ways that perhaps other spaces might not have as dramatically and on that scale, if that answers or addresses some of your, that's a great question. I love it.
I'm going to bring in a couple of questions from our viewers. And again, as a reminder, you can drop in questions at any time. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I'm going to start with actually a pair of questions from Thomas Anderson, who writes in to say, first, were Florida maps drawn differently by different European countries, e.g. Spain, England?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then Thomas also asks, are there any extant Florida maps drawn by Native Americans, such as Seminoles?
Yeah. That's such a good. So the second question, I'm not totally sure. There must be. I mean, I'm sure. I think somebody working directly in Indigenous studies in Native studies would be able to answer that question. And that's not really my field, but yeah, I would be shocked if there weren't maps of this space. But what I would say is, yeah, different European countries absolutely drew, and they were drawing on different mapping traditions. And so a lot of times the way that maps were made were you wouldn't visit the place, right? You would look at other maps that you could get your hands on of that place and then kind of try to do your own thing with it. It was much more rare to actually rely on firsthand experience of actually going into the landscape and doing the surveys that one needed to do to produce a more accurate map. Or sometimes, I think what's fascinating to me in charting Indigenous influence on maps is thinking about how oral traditions directly shape these massively influential European maps. So this pretty good evidence we have of the idea that the first map of Florida as islands was that way because there was an encounter with Indigenous populations who knew the landscape and said, hey, it looks like islands. And I like to, who knows the reasons for that, right? I mean, one thing I like to speculate is that maybe they were describing it that way because they were like, well, you better not come here. Nothing here for you to see. It's just islands. You know, I mean, I wonder how strategic that was in trying to keep people away. It could be that, but regardless, the fact that that image, which becomes literally like dominates European cartography of Florida for 200 years, comes from Indigenous knowledge of the landscape and Indigenous stories transmitted. To me, I think that is completely fascinating. And that was the path that I was following. And I kind of had my hands full in tracking that. That was like, took years to kind of piece this story together and track that out. So yeah.
If I can just tack on to that really briefly, because it's a topic we care a lot about. We actually just completed our K-12 team is teaching an NEH workshop for teachers called Mapping a New World. I know Alexandra's research goes into this as well. It's in your book, but we talk a lot about how these early European maps really, in a sense, are native knowledge, kind of laundered through European representational techniques, talking about how little colonial administrators, colonial map makers knew about the places that they were mapping. So what you are in fact seeing in the map is not European knowledge so much as it is oftentimes Indigenous knowledge.
Completely.
Yeah, no, I thought that was I thought that was a fascinating part of your book because also, in a sense, it kind of is islands, like not in a traditional, like, but if you're talking about, you can't really walk around down there, like you need a boat, like, so in a lot of ways, you can kind of see how that process of translation would happen. But
yeah, absolutely.
Just a fun sort of Boston example too. We all oftentimes are looking at how even 19th century cartographers tried to represent the tidelands around Boston that were in the process of being filled, and they make it look like islands, but of course it was intertidal. There just weren't the representational techniques to show this ambiguous landscape. Yeah. So I'm going to pull a couple of other questions. There's a lot of comments that are like, great talk, just so you know, Michelle. I'm not going to take every
take a look later.
Talk comment that came through. Here's one from Gia Patrick asking, I'd love to hear how you came to this topic and how your previous work informed it.
Well, there sort of was no. This was my first work. This was began as a dissertation in graduate school, but I also the way I came to the topic is really interesting. I mean, there's a short way to answer that, which is that I read William Bartram's travel narratives of Florida from the 18th century, which I found completely beautiful. I mean, it's not a novel, okay? There's no plot and there's no characters, fine. But you don't really study early America writing and expect to find that. And I was just absolutely like floored by the way he describes things like mangrove roots, these trees that essentially are creating their own dry land and are maintaining stability in a way that is radically counterintuitive, at least for the time period. They're moving continually and like creating solid ground through their roots. And this enables them to thrive through these like lateral, shallow roots. And I was just like floored by how beautiful how these descriptions were. And I just thought, what else is out there? What else? Is there other language like this? Is there this other potential imagination of possession itself, of property itself? And like, where is it coming from? Is it only coming from observations of mangroves, or were people looking at the actual living populations in Florida and thinking in this way? And so that's one answer. But but the other one is that, taking classes in graduate school, it was a wonderful graduate program, but there's just, when you're studying early America, there's not a whole lot out there about how to sort of bring Florida into the story in an interesting way. And I felt like this lack, and I thought people need to know this. If they're studying early America, I want to tell this story and have this be very deeply linked to literary, cultural, and historical traditions that I already know. And so I was trying to bring Florida in a way that was interesting mostly to me, turned out to be interesting to other people as well. So that was lucky.
I have to say, as somebody whose research is all in the Northeast, I was totally fascinated by this. I knew very little about Florida before reading your book, and it really captivated me. So for those of you who weren't interested in Florida before, this book is really great. Here's a question that wraps across a couple of comments. So I'm going to put it up in pieces from Ellen Stenstrom. Says, hi, Professor Navakas. So great to hear you teaching again.
Hi, Ellen.
With ever-increasing reports of the effects of global warming, we continue to see how geography will be affected by our practices, thus affecting the people who live on that geography. As scientists call for change in our environment-destroying behavior, how do you reconcile the need that you articulated for a reconsideration of the inherently liquid and porous nature of Florida and similar land then with the need for a drastic change in human behavior to prevent the further man-made erosion of land? Sorry for the multiple messages. And Ellen, no worries. We're happy to have long questions like that.
I wish I could see the entire question all at once, because I've slightly lost the thread, but you see the whole thing. Garrett, can you, I'm just seeing pieces. Maybe if I go to comments, let me take a look more carefully.
The question is about how do we reconcile the inherently liquid and porous nature with the fact that we need to act quickly, right? So we're faced with an indeterminate and shifting environment, but we need to make dramatic interventions in order to prevent or to mitigate these.
It's a great question. Exactly. This is, I mentioned the book at the beginning, but this book by Elizabeth Rush, Rising, where she's kind of grappling with exactly that problem by visiting coastal places all over the US in 2018 and asking people on the ground essentially that question. And one of the things in the book that I love that she does is she does talk to a historical geographer, so somebody who charts changes in the land. So what I started to realize, thinking, and I'm not going to be the first person to realize this, but it's those people who do historical geography, who do indigenous studies, who do anybody looking at these ways of living. I feel like they already have that knowledge, it's already there. So it wouldn't be a matter of having to go do that work. It's it's there, but people aren't talking to each other across. So I think this is a problem of siloed disciplines of the humanities not really speaking to the sciences enough, although that I see is beginning to change, thank God. But I think there are answers out there that could be quickly implemented. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that we all go live in huts over the ocean or something like that. That's not at all what I'm saying. It's more just that the ways of living on the land that these indigenous populations practice, what they did by looking at the land, by using collective knowledge, by understanding it, that's what I'm saying we need to be doing. Point being, I think that knowledge is out there of how to do those kinds of things. And I just think there's not enough. Yeah, it's kind of tragic, because I feel like there are solutions, but they're not getting to the right, people aren't hearing them. The people who could actually act. I mean, I'm an English professor. I'm going to do my best to document these things and to speak and to get it out there. But the people who might actually be on the forefront of being able to act and do things, those are the people that maybe need to hear.
Great. Another question from Gordon Means. Do you think the efforts to remediate the Everglades will present an opportunity to highlight the ability to, quote, live with the forces of nature?
Efforts to remediate. Remediate, I guess I think I would wonder what you mean by remediate. I'm really curious, because bring them back, bring back the Everglades, kind of I mean, I don't know enough about what's literally happening right now as we speak in the Everglades in terms of restoration. I don't know enough to tell you that. I hope so. I guess it's so It's so heartrending, I think, to fly in. I just flew to Florida back home a couple months ago, and it's really tough to fly over the Everglades and to see this landscape, and then to watch how the development begins. And there's something terrifying about it, and you sort of think, these people are walking around and like, do they realize that they're living on a swamp? And you really see it from an aerial perspective, and it really feels disheartening to see that, and it makes me think, well, our remediation is remediation really going to really help with what we have already done? But I'm an optimistic person, so I like to think so. But I don't know. I'm grateful that there are people trying to restore places like estuaries and swamps and wetlands. And I just, yeah, it's a huge question, right? This is like the massive question is like, can technology, can our restoration efforts, can these things ultimately save us, or have we reached the tipping point?
Michele, if I can ask a question that sort of brings us back in conclusion to the American Revolution as a theme, which of course is one of the organizing topics of this series. In the Map Center's previous exhibition, We Are one of the kind of arguments that's been in that exhibition is that the map of the country was as much a kind of triumphant symbol of the success of revolution as the Stars and Stripes or the new national government, this kind of bounded territory running from the St. Croix, which Alexander knows a lot about, all the way into the southeast and out to the Appalachians, symbolize this kind of integrity of the new nation. Now, of course, as you write, Florida didn't stop being watery. It didn't stop being porous just with the American Revolution. So could you say a bit about how Florida continued to kind of baffle and stymie these national presentations of a coherent, solid territory in the years immediately following the American Revolution?
Yeah, going into the 18th and then early 19th century, I mean, the primary push to gain Florida from Spain had everything to do with U.S. slavery, right? So Florida was this place where escaped enslaved people from plantations across the U.S. South knew that they could go seeking freedom among the Seminole. And so this was absolutely terrifying to all sorts of U.S. politicians, Andrew Jackson among them. And so the kind of push to expand into Florida was directly out of a fear of losing human, chattel and property during the time period. And so in that way, basically throughout the 19th century, there were these Seminole wars being fought, and a huge reason they were being fought was to try to eradicate a population that knew how to use the landscape to their advantage to claim the ground, and who were forging these very disturbing, at least to U.S. onlookers, many of them, not all of them, these very disturbing alliances with these populations of enslaved people running south to freedom. And so the story of that definitely plays a role in my book, but I think that what's really happening there is you're sort of seeing how this landscape and its resistance is becoming like the political issue of the 19th century in the decades after the revolution. For that very particular reason, the local populations knew the ground, and this was a direct threat to the entire economic basis of the U.S. as it began to develop during that time. So that's where I would point you to that. But I also am very glad you brought up Alla's wonderful work. I did have a chance to read before this, and I wanted to plug her work as well. I was just beautiful, wonderful, and the way that you're thinking about Nova Scotia, very different space, but through all of these sorts of projections that people had, like the different fantasies they projected onto the space, it was just extremely beautiful and wonderful. And yeah.
Well, thank you for the plug, and if I can kind of bounce off from that. As a fellow studier of peripheries, I love what you've been doing with Florida. So I'd love to invite you to talk about what do we gain from looking at places that are more quote unquote peripheral to a major dominant narrative like Florida. Normally we study early America, and it's massive. It's Boston, it's Philadelphia. What do we get when we look at Florida that we wouldn't otherwise get?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is these sort of alternatives that seem at first a little bit off the beaten path, like these different modes of possession or settlement. But then what's been interesting to me is to see how many people were actually interested in those alternatives. So at first, what seemed to me like a project that was sort of on the periphery or on the edges, I began to see as more and more central to the story as I started following out where people were actually going to find literature to read about Florida. And it's through they're going to places like that you've mentioned, like Boston and Philadelphia. A lot of the most of the materials that I write about were published and widely circulating materials, and they've sort of been left out of the narrative. And so I think for me, it's been fascinating to sort of see how a place even I considered to be somewhat peripheral, through my research, I started realizing, no, you could go downtown in Philadelphia and buy a book about Florida by William Bartram, right? And read that. And then to me, it makes us rethink what we think of as central, I guess, because if people were doing that, it's like, oh, this idea had more currency. It seemed like this weird alternative that no one was talking about, but that's not true. And I'm guessing that's probably the case with the peripheries you work on as well.
It's totally true, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes wonder if we haven't let our own modern conceptions of what's peripheral to the United States kind of paper over what's evident in the sources, which is that places like Florida and Nova Scotia were in fact tremendously important to condemn
people were
murders.
Debating them, talking about them, thinking about them, worried about them, because I mean, it's certainly in the case of Florida, the slavery issue makes it a central topic. Like people could not ignore it. You couldn't not have an opinion about the Seminole War, because that would mean you didn't have an opinion about slavery, and that's like most people had an opinion about slavery of some kind in the 19th century. So, yeah.
I was just going to say, if you want to take a intellectual trip up to the Northeast, Alexandra has an interview introducing her work on our website, leventhalmap.org, as well as a great new post in the blog of the Journal of the History of Ideas, JHI, which I encourage those of you who are interested in another early America to read.
Wonderful
pieces. Bookends.
Yes, exactly. The North and then the South. You got it.
Great. Well, we're just about at the top of the hour, so I want to wrap things up and say a huge thank you to Professor Michele Navakas for being with us tonight. This talk was really both beautiful and provocative, and I think just a perfect demonstration of the way that we can bring maps not as a kind of autonomous subject that stands on its own, but really helps us to rethink American history and culture in new ways. It was really super. So thank you, Michele.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me a chance and an opportunity to rethink my book. It's been very interesting to place it alongside these more environmental concerns in such a way that I wish I had done more of in the book, but you can't do it all. And this is giving me the chance to rethink and a platform to share it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to encourage our audience to give us some feedback on today's talk. You can follow the link below or be in the comments as well. It's just a short survey to help us shape our future programming. Of course, as a reminder, take a chance now, from now until August 16th, to buy Liquid Landscape at 30% off. I promise it's worth the read. When we open, we'll have a copy here in the Map Center for you to browse in our research collection as well. But to stay apprised of more events and activities at the Map Center, you can always visit our website, leventhalmap.org, or follow us on social media at BPL Maps. Now, don't forget, the next talk in this series is on October 26th, when Professor Kathleen Duval joins us on Seeing the Revolution from Beyond the Atlantic Coast. So follow us on social media or visit our website to subscribe to future events. And if you're in Boston at any time after September 10th, stop by the Central Library in Copley Square to visit our in-person exhibition, Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception. Again, the Leventhal Map and Education Center is supported by donors like you. Even a small donation helps us put on wonderful events like the one we heard tonight from Professor Navakas. Thanks again, Michele. Thanks, Alexandra. It's really great to see you both. Tonight's talk will be recorded and available online in YouTube after YouTube processes it through its computer brain. So feel free to revisit this at any time. See you later.
Bye. Thank you.